She had arrived early that afternoon, long before most people would think of stepping into the little cafe tucked on the corner of a quiet street. The place had a piano in the corner, old but polished, with a slightly worn bench. The cafe wasn't grand or fancy, but it had a warmth that made it feel alive. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of pastries and sunlight filtering through the windows gave the whole space a soft, comforting glow. She carried a small bag with her, nothing special, just some music sheets tucked neatly inside. No one paid her much attention as she moved to the piano, her steps quiet and deliberate, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the soft hum of conversations and clinking cups already filling the room. She wasn't there to perform officially. That was clear to everyone watching. People walked in and out, ordering coffee, laughing with friends, flipping through newspapers or typing on laptops. The usual crowd of students, workers, and tourists filled the cafe, their eyes rarely lifting toward the piano corner. Most of them assumed she was just someone who liked to sit by the piano, maybe to practice for herself. She didn't look like a professional pianist. Her clothes were simple, nothing flashy or attention. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she wore comfortable shoes. If anyone had judged her at first glance, they might have said she looked like someone who might only play simple tunes, just enough to pass the time. She took a deep breath as she sat on the piano bench. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment, not in hesitation, but in quiet preparation. She had played countless times before, but every time she sat at a piano, she reminded herself to be fully present, to listen, to feel. Today was not about showing off. Today, she simply wanted to play, and yet deep down, there was a nervous flutter she couldn't deny. It was not the stage fright that performers usually feel because she wasn't on a stage. It was something softer, a kind of self-awareness. The knowledge that people might underestimate her. The room was noisy, filled with background chatter and laughter. Someone called out from across the room to a friend, asking for a recommendation from the menu. The clatter of cups and spoons against plates seemed louder to her than it did to anyone else. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself breathe in the sounds of the cafe. Then slowly she opened them again and looked at the piano keys. They were old, some of the keys slightly chipped, but they held character. She touched them lightly, testing the sound, feeling the texture under her fingers. It was not a perfect piano, but it was enough. It was enough to express every note she had ever felt inside. A waiter approached her, holding a small notepad, probably wondering if she needed anything. She smiled politely but shook her head. She didn't want anything. She just wanted a quiet corner where she could play. The waiter nodded and left, clearly assuming she was just practicing or waiting. No one else seemed to notice her much. People were too absorbed in their own conversations or their phones to look around. That suited her just fine. She liked the anonymity. She liked the feeling of being just another person in a room, yet having the ability to create something special in that same space. Then, after a few minutes, a voice broke through. It was casual, light, almost careless. "Could you play something easy?" Someone said from the other side of the room. It wasn't a demand, just a small request, said with a smile that didn't expect much. Some people were listening, expecting maybe a few simple notes, something soft in the background while they continued talking. She opened her eyes fully now, looking toward the person who had spoken. He was a young man, perhaps a visitor, casually leaning against a table. His words were polite, yet they carried the assumption that she would only play something simple, something easy to fill the room without really drawing attention. She paused for a moment. Considering the words easy, that was the word she had heard many times before. People often underestimated what she could do, assuming her talent matched her quiet appearance, her unassuming presence. She smiled softly, not because she was offended, but because she knew that what she would play next had nothing to do with what anyone expected. Easy was a word for someone who didn't understand the depth of music, the power that could lie in a single melody. She wasn't there to meet expectations. She was there to play what her heart wanted to express. Her fingers hovered above the keys, poised but relaxed. She took another deep breath, letting the noise of the cafe fade into the background. The chatter, the clinking cups, the laughter, all became a soft blur. She was not invisible, yet she felt invisible in the best possible way. The world could continue around her, and she would create something that would hold its own space, separate from the noise. She pressed the first note gently, a soft sound that seemed almost like a whisper. Then the second note followed, smooth and steady. It was simple at first, almost unremarkable. The kind of gentle tune that wouldn't disturb anyone, that might even make someone glance up briefly without really noticing. But as she continued, something began to shift. There was a subtle confidence in the way her fingers moved, a grace in each motion that spoke of years of dedication, even if no one could see it yet. The notes began to flow, connecting in ways that were unexpectedly rich. Patterns emerged, harmonies that felt natural and effortless. She wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. She was thinking about the story she wanted to tell through the music, the feelings she wanted to convey. The gentle melody started to fill the cafe differently now. People who had been talking began to pause. Their heads lifted, curiosity piqued by a sound that felt familiar yet strangely moving. She didn't rush. Each note mattered. She let the keys sing, each tone carrying a little weight, a little story. Her hands glided over the piano with ease, but the beauty wasn't in speed or complexity. It was in expression, the honesty of the music that seemed to reach quietly into the hearts of anyone who cared to listen. Some people turned in their seats fully now, faces softening as they listened more carefully. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone quietly put down their cup. Others leaned forward, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. The music was becoming more than background sound. It was creating its own space, gently commanding attention without demanding it. She noticed the shift in the room, but didn't let it distract her. She kept playing, letting the melody guide her. Each chord held meaning, each pause created tension that drew listeners in. She had played alone many times, but this was different. Here in this small cafe, there were strangers, people who hadn't come to hear her, yet they were beginning to listen. The thought of reaching them, of touching even one heart, made her smile inside. She knew this was why she played. Not for applause, not for recognition, but for the quiet acknowledgement that music could communicate what words sometimes could not. As she continued, a few people quietly moved closer, their curiosity stronger than their initial indifference. The young man who had asked her to play something easy was leaning forward now, his eyes wide, trying to follow the delicate movements of her fingers. He hadn't expected this. No one had. She was proving, without words, that even a simple request could be transformed into something far greater than anyone imagined. The room was still noisy in the background, but the music created its own layer, a new rhythm that overlaid the ordinary sounds of the cafe. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. People were paying attention now, truly paying attention. Time seemed to slow. She played as if the outside world had vanished, as if only she and the piano existed. The notes floated, filled with emotion, rising and falling like a gentle wave. She didn't think about the people around her, yet she felt their presence, their silent acknowledgement of what was happening. It was a connection that needed no words. Even those who hadn't expected much now sensed that they were witnessing something rare, something beautiful, something that could not be repeated exactly the same way ever again. As the first part of her piece drew to a soft pause, the cafe was still. No one clapped, not yet. They were too captivated, too surprised by what they had just heard. Some held their breath, afraid to break the spell. Others simply leaned back, letting the music settle in their minds, in their hearts. She didn't rush to fill the silence with more notes. She let the moment linger, knowing that every second of quiet after a melody mattered as much as the notes themselves. It was just the beginning. She knew it. And she also knew that the journey she was about to take, from a simple request to something extraordinary, would not just surprise the people in the room, it would change the way they thought about music, talent, and appearances. For her, it was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced many times in private. But now it was different. Now there were witnesses, and witnesses could change everything. The first notes had been gentle, a simple beginning meant to ease her into the performance. But now, as she continued, something deeper began to take shape. Her fingers moved more freely, almost instinctively, and each note seemed to carry not only sound, but feeling. The cafe had been lively a moment ago, filled with chatter and movement, but slowly the atmosphere began to change. The music wrapped around the tables, weaving through conversations, softening laughter, making the clatter of cups seem distant, almost irrelevant. People who had just been speaking to friends were now listening, some leaning forward, their hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the piano. She wasn't thinking about them, not really. She was focused entirely on the keys, on the melody she had created in her mind long before she came into the cafe. Years of practice, hours spent alone in small rooms, practicing on pianos that were often out of tune or had broken keys. All of that had led to this moment. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but as she played, she realized that what was meant to be something easy had become far more than anyone could have imagined. The music began to flow naturally, each chord leading into the next, each note carrying a subtle emotion that she had felt herself but now shared with the room. A few people in the audience began to whisper to each other, not loud enough to disrupt the music, but just enough to share their surprise. "She's really good," one of them murmured, leaning toward their companion. "I didn't expect that," another replied, shaking their head slightly, as if trying to convince themselves they had seen it correctly. The young man who had requested something easy was now sitting completely still, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide, following every movement of her fingers. It was not just the sound that amazed him, but the confidence, the grace, the subtle way she seemed to command the music without forcing it. She felt the energy of the room shift. At first, it had been casual, background music that people could ignore. Now, it had become something alive, something that demanded attention in a quiet way. She could sense it, feel it, and it inspired her to play with even more depth. Her hands moved faster at times, not in a rush, but with precision and flow, creating a texture in the sound that was unexpectedly complex for a piece that had begun as simple. She had a habit of letting herself get lost in the music, allowing her emotions to guide her fingers. And now, as the audience listened, they could sense the layers of feeling behind each note. A few people who had been sitting near the entrance stopped walking, tilting their heads as if drawn in by something invisible. Their drinks and bags were left behind as they took small steps closer to the piano. Even the baristas behind the counter had paused, glancing toward her and then smiling softly, nodding to themselves. The cafe had always been a place where music existed, but never like this. No one had ever brought the quiet intensity, the depth of emotion that she was now filling the room with. It was as if the space itself had shifted, the walls leaning in slightly to listen. The air, charged with anticipation. Her fingers moved over the higher keys, producing light, almost sparkling notes, and then returned to the lower keys, rich and warm. The contrast between the two brought a story to life without a single word. She imagined a scene as she played a memory, a moment from her life, a feeling of hope intertwined with uncertainty, and it poured through the music. People began to stop whispering to each other. Their own thoughts became silent, replaced entirely by the sound. A young woman at a corner table, holding a notebook and pen, stopped writing mid-sentence, her eyes glistening as if she had been touched by something she could not explain. A man sitting near the window leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the melody wash over him as though it were the only thing that existed in the world. At that moment, it wasn't just technical skill that held their attention. Anyone could play fast or complicated notes, but what she was doing was different. Every pause, every slight variation in tempo, every gentle emphasis on a note made the music feel alive. It spoke to the listeners in a way that went beyond sound. It spoke to them in memories, in feelings, in unspoken connections. The cafe was no longer just a cafe. It had become a space of shared experience, a quiet concert hall where strangers were united by the power of music. And all of this had begun because someone had asked her to play something easy. The melody began to evolve. It shifted subtly, changing tone without losing its continuity. There were moments of lightness, almost playful, that brought a few smiles to faces. Then there were deeper, more introspective sections that made a few people sigh quietly or pressed their hands to their chest. She didn't notice them individually. She only felt the flow, the rising and falling of the music, and let it guide her. Sometimes her eyes would close, letting her body remember the movements without thinking, allowing intuition to take over. This was the part of her playing that she loved most, the feeling of being completely immersed, of becoming part of the music herself, so that it seemed to pour naturally from her soul. Someone near the back, a little boy who had been restless and fidgeting, stopped moving. He leaned on the edge of a table, watching, listening, his small hands gripping the edge as if to hold himself still. The notes seemed to speak to him directly. He didn't understand music in the way adults did, but he felt it. He felt something change inside him, a quiet awareness that something extraordinary could come from someone who seemed ordinary. His mother glanced at him, surprised, and then looked toward the piano herself. She, too, was captivated, her face softening as she realized that what was happening was beyond simple talent. It was a gift, something rare that made the ordinary feel remarkable. She moved into a section of the piece that was more complex, weaving together multiple melodies at once. It was not showy, not meant to display skill in a boastful way, but it revealed the depth of her understanding, the intelligence behind her playing. Some people in the room began to lean closer to hear better, drawn by the unexpected richness of the music. A few whispered, "How is she doing that? And I didn't expect this at all." The young man who had made the initial request stayed completely still, now fully aware that he had underestimated her. He wasn't alone. Almost everyone in the cafe had shifted from casual observer to engaged listener. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for each note to fall, waiting to see where the music would go next. She paused briefly, letting her hands rest lightly on the keys. The moment of silence was almost as powerful as the notes themselves. People exhaled softly, some opening their eyes, some closing them, all connected in that shared pause. She could sense their anticipation, but she didn't rush. Music, she knew, was as much about the spaces between notes as the notes themselves. She pressed her fingers down again, this time with a softer touch, creating a melody that felt like a conversation. One that invited the listeners to respond silently with their own emotions. And they did. Eyes glistened, heads tilted, small smiles appeared, and some held their hands over their hearts, feeling a depth of emotion that surprised even them. The melody continued to build. It was no longer just music filling the room. It was an experience, one that seemed to move through each person differently, yet with a common thread. Some remembered past joys, some felt a twinge of sadness, some simply felt peace. And all of it was coming from someone who a few minutes ago had been assumed to play something easy. She knew that many would never forget this moment. She could feel it, as if the energy of the room had shifted permanently. Her fingers danced across the keys, each one deliberate, each one expressive, carrying a story that only she fully understood, yet was now being shared with everyone around her. Time seemed suspended. A few people glanced at their watches but didn't move. They were afraid that any movement would break the magic. Conversations had completely stopped. Even the baristas had forgotten the orders they were preparing, their hands resting quietly on the counter, listening. The music had become the center of the universe, and she was the quiet, unassuming force holding it all together. The initial request to play something easy now seemed almost absurd. There was nothing easy about the way she had captured the attention, the hearts, and the minds of everyone in the cafe. She had taken a small, casual request and transformed it into something extraordinary, something that would linger in their memories long after the last note faded. As the piece moved into its next phase, the melody became more layered, with gentle crescendos that rose and fell like waves. She allowed herself to explore the highs and lows, letting each note resonate fully, filling the space with warmth and light. People leaned closer, some even moving their chairs, trying to feel the music more intimately. The young man who had first asked her to play was now sitting completely still, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. He had thought he was asking for something simple, but now he realized that he had witnessed something rare. A moment that was much more than a casual tune. The room had changed without anyone realizing it. Strangers had become witnesses, connected not by words, but by a shared experience. The music spoke a language that transcended barriers that didn't need explanations. And she, the quiet, unassuming pianist, had become the guide through this unexpected journey. Her performance was no longer about the notes themselves. It was about the way they touched lives, the way they created a space where ordinary people could feel something extraordinary. Her eyes lifted briefly, scanning the room, though not for validation. She saw faces softened by emotion, people leaning forward, listening more intently, some even whispering quietly to themselves. She smiled faintly, not for recognition, but for the simple joy that came from knowing that her music had reached them. That small, casual request had become a bridge, connecting her world to theirs in a way that was intimate, human, and profoundly real. And she continued, letting the melody guide her, letting each note carry the depth of her heart to every corner of the cafe. The music had been flowing for several minutes. And now, it was no longer just notes in the air. It had transformed the cafe completely. People who had come in with casual plans, thinking they would spend an hour drinking coffee and chatting with friends, now found themselves utterly absorbed. No one spoke. No one moved. The room had fallen into a quiet that was almost sacred, a shared silence that seemed to honor the melody flowing from the piano. Even the usual background noises, the clinking of spoons, the soft whir of the coffee machine, the murmur of distant conversations, had faded into insignificance. The music was everything, and the space around it seemed to bend to its presence. She felt it too. The notes were no longer just a sequence of sound. They carried the weight of emotion, of every memory she had poured into her playing over the years. Her hands glided across the keys effortlessly, yet each movement was intentional. There was a rhythm, a pulse, a living quality to the way the music flowed. She was telling a story, one without words, and every person in the cafe had become part of that story. She could feel their attention like a gentle current, pulling her deeper into the performance. Urging her to express even more, the young man who had asked her to play something easy sat frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. The simple request that had seemed casual now felt like the moment he had been given the rare privilege to witness something extraordinary. He had never expected this, and yet there it was before him, filling the room, transforming a mundane afternoon into a memory he would carry forever. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, and didn't dare move. It felt as though any small motion might break the spell. Other listeners were equally captivated. A woman sitting at the corner, who had been typing furiously on her laptop just moments ago, had abandoned her work entirely. Her hands rested on the table, her eyes fixed on the piano, and she seemed to be holding her breath as the melody rose and fell. She could feel it in her chest, a resonance that went beyond sound. A father and his young daughter had paused in their conversation. The little girl, staring wide-eyed, her small hands pressed together as if in prayer. She didn't understand the technicality or skill behind what she was hearing, but she understood the feeling. The way the music seemed to reach right into her small heart. Even the baristas had stopped what they were doing. Leaning against the counter with quiet awe, they had seen performers come and go in the cafe before, but nothing had ever created this sense of stillness, this gentle reverence. It wasn't just the talent, it was the sincerity, the honesty in the way she played that made the music so powerful. Each chord, each subtle change in tempo, each careful pause seemed to carry emotion beyond words. The melody wasn't just heard, it was felt, and that feeling spread quietly from one person to another, until everyone in the room was connected by it. She noticed none of this consciously. Her focus was entirely on the music, on the story she was telling through her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the melody guide her, letting her emotions flow naturally. The music swelled gently, then softened, rising and falling like waves. There was tension and release, moments that pulled at the heart and then let it breathe again. She was lost in the rhythm, the feeling, the invisible conversation between herself and the room. It was as if the piano was speaking a language that everyone could understand, without words, without explanation. Someone near the back of the room, a man who had been reading a newspaper, slowly lowered it. His eyes widened as he looked toward the piano. He had heard music before, but nothing like this. It wasn't just skill. It was the way she infused life into every note, the subtle storytelling that drew him in without him realizing it at first. He leaned forward in his chair, letting himself be carried by the melody. He could feel his own heartbeat syncing with the rhythm, as if the music had found a part of him that he had never known existed. The young boy who had been fidgeting earlier now sat completely still, his chin resting on his hands. His wide eyes followed every movement of her fingers, every subtle shift in posture, every slight change in expression. He could feel something stirring inside him, a quiet awe. A realization that someone so ordinary in appearance could create something so extraordinary. He glanced at his mother and she smiled softly at him, her own eyes shining with tears. She didn't even realize she was holding back. The music had reached them both, and neither of them had expected it. The melody deepened now, moving into a more emotional space. She allowed herself to explore the feelings she had kept hidden for so long, the moments of doubt, the moments of joy, the quiet victories, and the small defeats that had shaped her. Every note reflected something personal, something true. She didn't know who was listening in detail, but she could feel the presence of the audience as an extension of her own expression. They were witnesses, not judges, and that understanding gave her the freedom to play fully, to pour herself into the music without restraint. A gentle tension built in the room. People leaned forward slightly, drawn into the crescendo, their hearts following the rise and fall of the notes. Some had tears in their eyes, others simply stared, mesmerized. No one moved. It was as if the cafe had become a temple of sound, a sacred place where time itself paused. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed softer now, as if it too were listening. The ordinary afternoon had been transformed into a moment that felt timeless. Her hands danced across the keys, moving between highs and lows, crafting layers of melody that intertwined seamlessly. She was no longer playing a simple tune. She was telling a story, a narrative that could only exist through music. The room seemed to hold its breath, caught in the tension and release, in the gentle rise and fall of emotion. People were experiencing her story in their own ways. Some felt nostalgia, others felt hope, others a bittersweet longing. And all of it came from a young woman who had been underestimated, who had been asked to play something easy, who had quietly decided to play something that reflected her soul. A few whispered quietly to each other, not wanting to break the spell. "She's incredible," one said, barely audible. Others shook their heads softly, unable to find words that matched what they felt. The young man who had made the request sat completely still, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had expected something simple, background music at best. And now he was witnessing an unfolding moment of artistry that felt far beyond the ordinary. He wanted to speak, to say something, but he realized there were no words that could capture it. Even the cafe staff, who were used to seeing performers, had stopped what they were doing. Orders were forgotten. The espresso machine quieted down, and everyone moved closer, drawn by the depth of the performance. There was a hush in the air, a reverent silence, as if the music had claimed the room entirely. She continued to play, fully immersed, allowing every feeling, every thought, every memory to guide her hands. The music was no longer just sound. It was life itself, flowing into the room, touching every person present in a unique, personal way. She reached the peak of the piece, the notes rising, carrying energy and emotion, filling every corner of the cafe. Some listeners pressed their hands to their chests, feeling the vibrations in a way that was almost physical. Others leaned forward, eyes closed, allowing themselves to be carried entirely by the sound. There was no talking, no movement, only presence, only shared experience. The young boy's small hands trembled slightly as he held himself still, moved by feelings too big for words. His mother watched him with quiet pride, sharing in the awe of the moment. And then, as suddenly as it had built, the melody softened. She allowed her fingers to linger on the keys, letting each note fade gently into the next. The room was silent now, not from lack of awareness, but from complete absorption. Every person was holding their breath, reluctant to break the moment, unwilling to disturb the fragile beauty that had filled the space. Even the sunlight seemed still, as if it were waiting alongside them. For a few seconds, there was no cafe, no conversation, No outside world, only the echo of music and the shared presence of everyone who had been touched by it. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, and she looked up briefly. The room slowly became aware of itself again. People exhaled softly, almost reverently. Some blinked, as if waking from a dream. A few tears were brushed away silently. The silence was profound, heavy with emotion, and yet gentle, like the last echo of a beautiful story. She had started with something small, something that had seemed simple and ordinary, and she had transformed it into something that left everyone in awe. The young man who had made the request finally spoke. His voice soft, almost a whisper. That was amazing," he said, shaking his head slightly. Others nodded, some whispering their agreement, still caught in the afterglow of what they had experienced. No one could find words that fully matched the depth of what they had just heard. It was not just music. It was a story, a feeling, a moment of shared humanity. And in that moment, she realized something important. It wasn't the applause, the recognition, or even the acknowledgement that mattered most. It was the connection, the understanding, the unspoken bond created by something beautiful and true. The first part of her extraordinary performance had ended, but the memory of it lingered in the air. People looked at each other, exchanging quiet, astonished glances, each processing the experience in their own way. The cafe, which had been ordinary only minutes ago, had been transformed. For a brief time, it had become a place where the extraordinary existed, where the quiet presence of one unassuming pianist had the power to touch hearts, change moods, and leave everyone present forever changed. The last note had faded, lingering in the air like a soft echo of something unforgettable. The cafe remained silent for a few moments longer, as if no one wanted to disturb the delicate stillness that had been created. People slowly began to blink, slowly became aware of their surroundings. And yet the magic of what had just happened remained firmly planted in their hearts. It was one of those rare moments when time seemed to stretch, when the ordinary world disappeared. Leaving only the shared human experience of beauty, she rested her hands lightly on the keys, taking a deep breath. Her heart was still racing, but not with fear. It was the quiet, fulfilling thrill of knowing she had shared a piece of herself, of knowing that the music had reached people in a way words never could. She looked around the room, noticing faces softened with emotion, eyes wide with surprise, and a few people even wiping away small tears. This was not something she had planned to elicit. She had not come for recognition, applause, or praise. She had come simply to play, to express, to let the music flow. And yet now, she realized that she had given the people in the cafe something they would not forget. A hush lingered, broken only by the soft rustle of chairs as people adjusted themselves, as if unsure how to return to the ordinary routines of life after having experienced something so extraordinary. The young man who had first asked her to play something easy finally found his voice. He leaned forward slightly, eyes wide, as if afraid the moment would disappear if he spoke too loudly. Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and curiosity. It wasn't a demand. It was a genuine question, a longing to understand the story behind what they had just heard. She smiled softly, quiet, humble smile that reflected both gratitude and something deeper. She didn't answer immediately, letting the words hang in the air. She could feel the eyes of the entire cafe upon her, each person waiting for an explanation, waiting to understand how someone so unassuming could produce music so rich, so moving. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and soft. "I've been playing for a long time, mostly alone. Music has always been my way to feel, to express what I cannot say with words." The young man's mouth opened slightly, and he shook his head slowly, as if trying to process the truth in her words. Others around him murmured softly, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and admiration. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that the quiet, modest young woman at the piano had spent years perfecting her craft, shaping her emotions into something so profound. She had been underestimated, as people often were, judged by appearances and assumptions rather than talent and dedication. And now that judgment was completely undone. A woman sitting nearby, holding a coffee cup, whispered to her companion. She didn't just play music, she told a story. It's like she shared a piece of her life with all of us. Companion nodded, eyes still fixed on the pianist, as though trying to memorize every movement, every subtle gesture. Others in the room exchanged quiet glances, realizing that they had all been witnesses to something rare and beautiful. There was no need for applause, though a few tentative claps began to echo softly. Growing steadily as the realization of her talent sank in, she didn't seek the applause. But she accepted it with a quiet grace, a gentle nod to the people around her. She could see the change in their expressions, the newfound respect that replaced the casual assumption of mediocrity. The moment was not about her ego or her recognition. It was about connection. She had transformed a simple request into an experience that touched hearts, that reminded everyone present that talent and beauty often hide in unexpected places. Waiting to be discovered, a man who had been quietly observing from a corner spoke up, his voice filled with curiosity and admiration. "You've never performed publicly before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not really," she replied. "I've always played for myself, for small moments, for people close to me sometimes. I didn't expect to perform here today." His eyes widened slightly, as if the humility in her words made her talent even more remarkable. The realization dawned on everyone. This was not someone seeking fame or attention. This was someone sharing a gift out of pure love for music. Out of a desire to connect with others through the language of sound, people began to talk quietly among themselves, sharing their astonishment, their wonder at what they had just experienced. The young man who had requested something easy looked around, almost embarrassed. He had expected a simple tune, background music, to fill the cafe, and instead, he had been drawn into a performance that had touched his heart. He realized how often people misjudge others based on appearances, and how surprising and humbling it could be to witness true talent emerge unexpectedly. He gave a small, apologetic smile, acknowledging silently that he had been wrong to underestimate her. She noticed all of this, but didn't let it distract her. She had learned long ago that true expression was not about recognition, but about sincerity. Yet she could not deny a quiet warmth that spread through her chest as she saw the faces around her soften. As she saw the respect in their eyes, she had been underestimated, overlooked, assumed to be ordinary. And now she could see the truth reflected back at her. People were recognizing not just her skill, but her dedication, her honesty, the heart she poured into every note. The cafe began to feel alive in a new way. Conversations started not with loud chatter, but with quiet admiration. People sharing their feelings about what they had just heard. "I didn't know music could do that," one whispered. "It felt like she was speaking to me," another replied. People began to smile at each other, exchanging glances that said without words, "Did you feel that too?" The simple request for something easy had become a catalyst for connection, for shared human experience, for recognition of something extraordinary hidden in plain sight. She gathered her music sheets, tucking them neatly back into her bag, though there was no real need. People continued to speak softly, lingering near the piano, reluctant to let the moment end. A few approached her cautiously, offering words of admiration, asking about her background, wanting to know more about the person behind the music. She answered with quiet humility, sharing just enough to satisfy their curiosity, without seeking attention or praise. Each answer revealed more about her dedication, the years of practice, the moments of struggle and triumph that had shaped her skill. One by one, people began to express how deeply they had been moved. Some were surprised that they had been so touched, admitting they had not expected to feel anything beyond simple enjoyment. Others felt inspired, realizing that hidden talents existed everywhere, often unnoticed, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The cafe had become more than a place to drink coffee. It had become a space where ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary talent. A reminder that magic often appears when least expected. She noticed a few young musicians lingering near the piano, eyes bright with curiosity and admiration. They were not just impressed, they were inspired. They asked her questions about technique, about how she learned, about how she practiced so diligently. She answered softly, sharing pieces of wisdom she had gained through years of quiet study and self-discipline. She spoke of patience, of dedication, of the importance of feeling the music rather than just playing the notes. Their eyes shone, absorbing every word, silently acknowledging that they had witnessed someone truly remarkable. The young man who had first made the request finally found a way to smile fully, an expression of genuine respect and awe. He approached her gently, saying, "I didn't know. I never imagined you could play like that. Thank you for sharing your music." She nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, not seeking more words, for she knew that the connection had already been made. His respect, his admiration, and the transformation in the room were enough. Gradually, the cafe began to return to its ordinary pace. Cups were lifted, chairs moved, conversations started again, yet nothing felt the same. People spoke softly, with a lingering awareness that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something rare. The ordinary afternoon had been touched by a remarkable talent, a human presence that transcended expectations, a reminder that the simplest gestures or request for something easy could lead to the most profound experiences. She packed her bag fully now, standing from the piano with quiet grace. People continued to watch her, some hesitating to break the spell entirely, yet all aware that a moment had passed that could never be recreated exactly the same way. She offered a final nod, a gentle smile, and began to step away, not seeking attention, not demanding recognition, but leaving a trail of awe, respect, and inspiration in her wake, even after she left. People remained at the cafe softly discussing what they had just experienced, exchanging words of wonder and appreciation. Some quietly admitted they had been wrong to judge her. They had underestimated her simply because she did not appear extraordinary at first glance. Others felt inspired to look beyond appearances in their own lives, to recognize hidden potential in people they might have overlooked. The young man who had asked for something easy sat for a long moment, staring at the piano, thinking about the lesson he had learned, that talent, dedication, and heart could not be judged by anything but the music itself. And somewhere in all of this, she walked quietly into the sunlight outside, carrying nothing but her bag, a little tired but profoundly fulfilled. She knew that she had shared something rare, something that had touched lives, and yet she remained humble, grounded in the understanding that music was not about recognition, but connection. Today, she had turned a simple request into an extraordinary experience, and in doing so, she had left a mark on everyone who had listened, even if they did not yet fully realize it.